June 5th. And if you were like Andy, not paying attention at all to the oil markets, but off winning major bicycle races, the Tour of Cambridgeshire. Andy, you just one amazing achievement after another on your cycling. Mabruk, congrats, man. Big win for Andy this weekend at the UCI Cycling Masters World Championship held, and which he's going to go to in Scotland. So very big congrats to you, Andy, on that. So I have to start that, of course. That's a lot more important than what is, I mean, my point being ultimately, if you'd gone away on Friday and come back this morning and looked at the oil markets and nothing else, you would wonder what's all the noise about. A dollar move, a 1% move up in the oil markets. What's the big deal? Omar Najia, Global Head of Derivatives, BB Energy. Were you paying attention this weekend, Omar? Nothing much happening in Vienna. Your thoughts?
But I think, there was a high on the market. It's trading about 72.85 now on WTI, but the high was like $75 or so. So I think everybody got really excited, or whoever stayed up late to watch, or whoever bought when the market first opened, and then we came back down again. But I think basically the general thing is not the kind of +2, -1, and divide by 17 and all this kind of stuff. I think the important bit is that all this talk about OPEC is not going to hold and not going to do and not going to blah 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 blah. So all they do is they go and they basically say, right, this is a line in the sand. So what I like about lines in the sand is if you wanna kind of break it and go past it and push them, then it's going to cost you money. You've got to put your money where your mouth is. And there's absolutely no reason that I can see for anybody to want to do that. So if somebody's telling you, if the Fed says to you upwards, why would you fight it? And if OPEC is saying to you, this is our line in the sand, $75 Brent, whatever, you can argue about, 75, 76, 73, 70. If they're telling you up, and stuff like ouching and all this kind of stuff, you listen. I wouldn't bet against them. I'm not going to bet against them. So I'm listening. I think basically this market's going to head a lot higher. And for anybody who's watching, Brent from the highs that we had in 2022, the set, if you draw a line straight down from that high, it has 3 points that are touching it, meaning that if this market can get over $80 on Brent, then what's going to happen, not, China's going to do and the US is going to buy and OPEC's going to, none of that. It's going to mean basically that people are going to start buying back a massive amount of shorts. So the Brent just needs to pop its head over 80, and you're going to see basically, I think, a deluge of buying simply because of people closing shorts. So that's what I think in general.
Kate Durian, Mies contributing editor and non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. Kate, what's your takeaway from the weekend? The only sort of quantifiable change that I've been able to identify with all the noise, bar what's going to happen in 2024, but in terms of this year, is that Saudi made a unilateral decision to cut another, on the average, 100,000 barrels a day on average, annualized, if you like, 1 million barrels a day in July. Annualized is 100,000, less than 100,000 barrels a day cut. Ultimately, not much has changed. Your thoughts?
The Saudi, the energy minister spoke about lollipop and icing on the cake, and I think it's a gift. I mean, there is one winner from all of this, and that's the UAE, which got a big bump of 200,000 barrels a day. The others who can't produce a quota were sort of reduced. So basically,
this is for 2024, essentially.
This is for 2024. But for now, all they've done is they basically formalized this 1.16 million barrel per day cut that eight of them had agreed until the end of the year. But don't forget, we're entering into the season where domestic demand in the Middle East is going to rise as well, particularly for crude burn. And Saudi Arabia is the biggest. So Mies calculates that crude burn and fuel oil, some of it imported from Russia, of course, averaged 870,000 barrels per day in the first quarter. Of course, that's going to rise. And that's a record. So I think, you've got Middle East demand. There's a lot of betting on China, but it's also, I think, for Saudi Arabia to announce a unilateral cut, the prince said, "Oh, it's happened before. We've done it before." It's true, they've done it before, but when you think of the fact that Russia is not actually reducing by the 500,000 barrels per day that they pledged back in April, then it's also a gift in a way, I suppose, just to maintain cohesion, giving it to the UAE, so they're happy, even though they still have a lot of capacity. And also sort of say to Russia, okay, fine, you can't do it. If you're not doing it because you need higher income, then we'll reduce. So it's interesting. The prince talks about giving market stability and transparency, but at the same time, you can't say that and then say, oh, we're going to keep the market guessing as to whether this 1 million will be extended beyond July. So, there's a bit of mixed messaging, and I think it wasn't properly explained at the press conference yesterday in Vienna as to what this agreement really entails. So they are going to revise all the production capacities going forward and then allocate, new quotas on the basis of capacity. So I think it was important, but I don't think it was fully explained. So we're all sort of running around trying to analyze what actually happened. But I think it's generally bullish, because if you look at the demand projections for the second half, if they materialize, 60% of it in China, then you are going to have a tight market. So it might be a bullish outcome.
Andrew Critchlow, Head of News, EMEA, S&P Global Commodity Insights. Your thoughts, Andy, on the weekend's activities. Does it change the fundamental direction of this market that's kind of been listless, looking for wind in the mid-70s, 70 plus, 70 minus? Ultimately, we've been sort of stuck in a range for a while. Does this break us out of that? Your thoughts?
No, I don't think it does. And the reason for that is that no one trusts Russia. No one in the market trusts what Russia is saying in terms of any commitment it may make or may not make to quotas. No one trusts Russia on anything they would say in terms of policy directive until you have clarity in terms of the direction of the war in Ukraine. We have a well-flagged counter-offensive by the Ukrainians, which may have started. It may not have started. It may yet happen. News this morning from the Donetsk that the Russians are claiming that they've repelled a major attack. If you get a quagmire in Ukraine heading into the next winter, the geopolitics around that conflict changes again. Will there be a lot of pressure to bring Kyiv to the negotiating table with Moscow? Will that come from the US? Will it come from NATO partners? Or will they double down? Will they continue to arm Ukraine, escalate the conflict? All this plays into Russian energy policy. Russia is essentially producing what it wants. A tremendous amount of sensitivity now around the reported numbers of Russian production. We did some work on dark ship-to-ship transfers globally, what we've observed this year, 225% increase. Pretty much all of that is down to Russia. Yes, the sanctions are designed to be porous so that you don't get this oil shock situation, which transpired in the 1970s, obviously led and fed very much into the stagflationary economic story that played out throughout the 70s and early 80s. Policymakers in the US, Europe obviously don't want that, but they've kind of created that of their own choosing, whether that's monetary policy, tightening, slowing economies, and high inflation. Although inflation in Europe is coming down somewhat, it's pretty sticky, and no one is talking about inflation being transitory anymore. So this all plays into this scenario, and ultimately, you're talking about Saudi Arabia implementing a voluntary cut, which kind of adds up to 0.3 days worth of demand cover. It's a drop in the ocean. It's sentiment driven. So I don't see the market buying this, and primarily because I think the market has completely lost trust in what Russia says. Ultimately, Russia's motive here is for a lower oil price because it narrows the gap between the cap and dated Brent to the point where it's basically meaningless. The big question now is, do we get a big response from the EU, from the US in terms of lowering the cap?
Omar, your thoughts there on the earlier point that the Saudis and the OPEC plus, you would say, but I would say, you know, principally the Saudis perhaps have put a line in the sand and said, you know, at your peril, cross it on the short side. But ultimately now in the last month, or not 6 weeks or whatever, 2 months, let's say, they made now a commitment to cut 1.5 million barrels voluntarily, unilaterally, whatever it is. They were 10.5 million barrels a day in early May or early April. They're now at their production quota, signaling going down to 9. Can this line be held, or how much more do they need to keep sort of cutting, if you like, in order to hold that line?
Let's basically try and make it simple, right?
Yeah.
So everybody's confused as to why OPEC, Russia, anybody who has oil wants to push it through the ceiling or push it. That's because everybody's telling them that, you know, we're going carbon zero and all this kind of stuff. We're going to end.
When you mean push it through the ceiling, you mean push it higher, push
it higher,
right?
Push it higher, whatever it takes, right? You could sit and talk for, you know, whatever, say that they're going to do maybe, no, and I don't know what. It doesn't matter. All that matters basically for them is that now they have an interest in pushing oil for as high as possible, for as long as possible, so they maximize revenue. I mean, doesn't every economy do the same thing, right? So the days that basically, no, the Americans will have a quiet word and the British will have a hey dad, the French will do, they're all absolutely stuffed. So they're not going to have a quiet word and nobody's going to listen to them, right?
But ultimately, is it very difficult to achieve that? That's my point, that even though you want it, but when the world's biggest economies are in a flatlining to declining posture, although China, you'd say, is still growing, but ultimately its data is signaling that it's, you know, it's flatlining from a China point of view. US and Europe are in some state of, you know, ailment. So when the world's biggest economies are flatlining to declining, it's very difficult for oil producers, no matter what they do, to keep that elevated price posture. How much can they cut in order to keep achieving that?
No, I disagree, basically. So incremental demand comes from the East, not from the West. The West is already, you know, deindustrialized. I mean, the US makes very little. The British make even less, right? In terms of manufacturing. The Germans are heading the way of the Brits and the Americans. So, I mean, it's you know, they might drive cars, they might heat homes and need, you know, air conditioning and all this kind of stuff. But apart from that, incremental demand isn't coming from the West. The West is becoming less and less and less important. Doesn't mean it's not important right now, but it means basically nobody will listen to them anymore. So they can sit in the corner and shout and say no, and we can't, and we mustn't, and we hide that. But, you know, China's growing. The East is growing, emerging markets, Latin America. Yeah, okay, the US is whatever, but the US produces their own oil, right? Europe is, you know, I don't know what they're going to do. Probably use candles or something. I have no idea. But in terms of, but seriously, in terms of, this is basically a geopolitical thing. This is not kind of, you can't look at something and analyze it separately. So the Saudis have a foreign policy. So does the UAE, so do the Russians, so do all these countries. One of them is this oil thing, but it's all interconnected. They're all going to stand together against the West, not because they don't like them or because they're a different shade of skin color, but simply because it's not in their interest any longer to basically stand with them. That's why the world is de-dollarizing. Doesn't mean it's going to happen tomorrow, but it means it's inexorable and it's going to happen, just like the world de-sterlingized. And that's, you know, it's going to happen. Might take a year, might take 200 million, but it's going that way and you can't stop it. And the same thing is happening with the West. Yeah.
Kate, I'm wondering, when I saw the announcement of the Saudi decision to do the unilateral 1 million for 1 month in July, which they announced, I can't imagine that the Saudi oil minister brought the whole OPEC plus circus to Vienna to tell us that was kind of, it seemed to me, the last card. If we don't get everybody else on board to do this, we're going to have to do it ourselves. I'm wondering, did OPEC plus, did Saudi as the leader of OPEC plus get what you would imagine they wanted when they went to Vienna on Friday?
I think they kind of deferred it because they did have these meetings with the African ministers. They had meetings, separately with well, at least Prince Abdulaziz did. And I have a feeling that there was pushback, and he wanted to come out with an agreement, not go out empty-handed. So they had this, and I'm sure that the decision to have independent assessments of individual capacity by the member states was something that wasn't decided on the spot. It's being worked out, talking to the price reporting agencies like Platts and others on Russian supply. So I think, I don't think the decision by Saudi Arabia was again taken on the spot. I mean, all of this, it's not something that would happen, on the spot. But it was probably the sort of it was in his mind. It was Plan B, and when it didn't, when the African ministers were not on board, because Angola is saying, for example, our capacity is going to go up. We've got new fields coming, so if you reduce our baseline, then we're going to have to cut more, even though we've got fields coming up. And Angola is one of those countries that isn't producing a quota. Neither is Nigeria. And now you're going to have probably more from Nigeria because the end of subsidies means that domestic demand is going to go down. But you look at OPEC numbers and you look at IEA numbers, and they are pretty bullish on demand overall for 2023. The IEA's got it at 2.2 million barrels a day demand increase, and OPEC has it at 2.33. So how do you reconcile that with cutting production? And let's not forget, the collective action by the IEA has ended, so that countries will now have to start filling up their strategic stocks, which they drained in 2021-22. So I just think it's, there is potential for a tighter market, and Saudi production and, well, at least Saudi supply to the market may actually come down because of rising demand. You've got the whole region. It's pretty hot now. My cold water is hotter than my hot water, when I open the tap. Now, the UAE is not a big burner of crude oil because they've got gas, they've got nuclear. Saudi Arabia will, in the second half, maybe have some more solar and wind capacity, but it doesn't have enough gas. It's got, it's burning crude oil,
and it's got huge
Kuwait, not so much
development plans that it has to
exactly,
fund and power.
And one final thing, one final thing I wanted to say. I mean, one of the reasons why oil was supported last year was because of the switch from gas, which was at records, right? So you had the switch, particularly in Europe, switch from gas to crude oil. That's not going to happen now because gas has come off. So I think, there isn't that much support, but at the same time, demand rising, particularly in the Middle East, means that maybe Saudi supply to the market will actually be lower anyway without this 1 million cut. Or it will be about 1 million if they're going to be using 500,000 or something per crude ton.
Andy, I wanted just to get to the Saudi-Russian thing, because there was reporting about the reporting that the reason some of the certain news agencies were barred from accessing the OPEC building in Vienna this weekend was because of reporting that was pointing towards perhaps a divergence in this partnership of Saudi Arabia and Russia. Do you think there's any meat on the bone there? Novak the deputy prime minister came to Vienna, obviously showing a big commitment because of, obviously showing up in itself is a major, I suppose, expression of solidarity. Where do you think that union is at this time, given that we're now getting into a situation where we're not sharing the burden of this oil cut?
I think Russia's relationship with OPEC has always been contentious and has always been fragile, and historically it has. I mean, if you go back to 2015, I remember Igor Sechin at the Oil and Money Conference in London at the time, and this is just before the kind of period that led into OPEC Plus, directly attacking OPEC as a cartel and essentially structuring a speech around how Russia would have nothing to do with it, and thought it was something that was anti-competitive and against its own interests. Is Sechin less sort of central to the Kremlin's policy thinking these days? That's a moot point. He's certainly a very powerful individual in terms of Russia's energy industry. So what changed? Well, the Kremlin's view of what OPEC could do for Russia changed. And I think that this is the misconception, is that, Russia isn't doing this. Russia isn't aligned to OPEC because it likes Saudi Arabia. It's not aligned to OPEC because it wants to be part of this group. It's aligned to OPEC because it ruthlessly serves its national interest and its own foreign policy goals. And what are its own foreign policy goals at the moment? Well, clearly it's to annex a large part of Ukraine, if not all the country. And so, I just come back to the trajectory of the conflict in Ukraine, and ultimately what does Russia want out of this relationship? Yes, it needs higher oil prices ultimately, and it needs to produce and sell more of its crude on the open market to sustain the regime. If OPEC can deliver that, then OPEC Plus will survive and thrive, and Russia will remain part of the alliance. If it can't, then why would Russia remain part of OPEC? And that's just working through things logically. That's not a view. That's just the logical progression of how I would see this relationship developing.
Well, it seems at the moment, at least, the relationship is more important than sharing of the burden of keeping the market up. Let's go to the survey question, which is obviously sort of looking at this issue. How will all of the announcements made by OPEC Plus yesterday, because I had to put in all of the announcements because I have to say there were so many, I didn't know which one to really focus on. And then, of course, the 1 million grabbed all the headlines, but it kind of gave them a bigger bang for their buck, hence the big pop up in prices and then the fall down, because ultimately it isn't a 1 million barrel a day cut. It is a 1 million barrel a day cut for 1 month. But anyway, how will all of the announcements made by OPEC Plus yesterday impact Brent oil over summer months, i.e. June, July, August, let's say? Anything beyond that seems a bit too far away to make anything sober in its judgment. But will these announcements collectively be bullish and push prices higher, 80 plus average over the summer? Will it be a sort of a nothing burger and bears lower to 70 and minus on Brent? Or no change, really? We're in the 75-ish doldrums and there isn't any big wind here to change the direction of this current market. So your thoughts on that, of the decisions over the weekend and their impact on the direction of travel over the coming months. Omar, obviously the big news of the weekend being all things OPEC Plus in Vienna, but elsewhere, do you see anything else that is, giving us some direction? We had very big job numbers out of the US on Friday. The economy there continues to be quite strong. Europe, although Germany technically in a recession, we had Christoph Ruhl tell us yesterday that even though that's technically in recession, when you look out your window, everybody's at their business, busy.
And sometimes I just, I think I'm living in this alternate universe, right? So Germany is deindustrializing. The price of their energy has moved up massively. They're an economy which basically...
Massively and down again, though. I mean, it moved massively last year, but back down quite quickly this year in terms of the gas price, at least.
No. Here's, what Einstein said. It's all about relativity. It's all relative. So basically, relative to other people, other countries paying for energy, their energy costs are still skyrocketing, right? Relative, right?
Right.
So basically, they are no longer competitive in producing anything, very little of anything. They will deindustrialize. The engine of Europe is done, kaput, as we like to say, right? So that's kind of on one thing. the US economy, the jobs, first we were saying before that, they're flatlining the US economy because, oil prices can't go up because they're flatlining. Now we're saying it's quite strong. So the US economy, the jobs are changing. So from one job where one person worked, 7 hours a day at a normal job, that's counted as one job. But if he works 3 different jobs working 3 hours a day, then that's counted as 3 different jobs. So it's all basically smoke and mirrors. So
isn't that the point? I mean, ultimately, this sort of sort of coexisting realities that there's technical recession, but yet there's still full employment. You've got these coexisting economic realities that ultimately, from your narrative, should be supportive and bullish. I mean, that's the other part of the equation.
So in brief, the West decided that basically they were going to try and eat a Russian pie. So the Americans and the Europeans all joined together and said, yum, yum, here we come. We're basically going to split this pie and everybody's going to be really, really happy. And basically what they found is economically, they have, sanctions are useless. The stuff about the price cap, useless. On the battlefield, they've been basically hammered. Now, I know in the West, sometimes, they
but bring it all home to the immediate reality rather than the change
so
they were going from the Roman Empire to some other empire. What's this week?
The immediate reality is that there is the kind of expectation that somehow the economies of Europe and the US are still going to chug along, I think is a fallacy. So I really don't expect them to.
Well, they're going to chug along at least this week. And that's the point I'm making. Ultimately, where is the upfront month? Kate, I'm thinking that the decision by the Saudis and OPEC Plus, obviously next year, 2024, I was curious that they actually decided to tackle that this weekend. But the decision by the Saudis, the month of July, could be a kind of a bridging tactic. As you said, the second half of the year, bionic demand is just around the corner. It's a bit like this recession that's coming, that's just around the corner. And this is, in a way, a decision to bridge this sort of little vacuum period till that kicks off. Your final thoughts on that, where we go from here?
Well, my final thought is that we haven't seen the end of Chinese demand growth, because there's still gaps in jet fuel demand, there's still gaps in industrial demand. So I think there is some mileage there on the demand side. I don't think it's particularly bullish, but again, the Saudis don't seem to be so worried about growth in US shale production anymore. If you look at the rig counts, they're way down. So that aspect that used to drive policy is no longer there. So it's, Russia, Saudi Arabia basically saying, we're not so worried about the state. So yeah, we reduced by 1 million. It's no big deal. We're going to use it anyway. So I think it's, that's out of the game. So I think the market, the whole dynamic has changed. The geopolitics have changed.
Last word with you and the survey result, which is no change, 75-ish over the summer. The Bulls and the Bears sharing the other half. I wanted just to get your thoughts, Andy, on this decision to tackle the 2024 production quotas, and as to why that was dealt with now, and is it really that significant a change? I mean, the Emiratis, I'm sure, would love to get 200,000 more on their quota, but if you look at what their capacity is, it doesn't feel like a big change. But your thoughts is why now, and how significant it is?
I think they had to do it now to take some of the heat out of the conjecture that there was a rift building between the UAE and Saudi Arabia over OPEC. I think, as you quite rightly said, 200,000 barrels a day in terms of what the UAE's capacity goals are to go to 5 million barrels a day. You look at the infrastructure that they're putting into Fujairah, whether it's the pipeline, whether it's the railway, whether it's the expansion of the terminal there, the expansion and investment in Ruwais. The UAE clearly, to Omar's point, wants to get the oil out of the ground while it can. That debate isn't going to go away. And I think this essentially kicks the can down the road into next year. And I would suspect very much that comes back to the fore. There are indications that the UAE and Saudi Arabia on a foreign policy level are heading in opposite directions. The UAE very much a major partner in the Abraham Accords. Saudi Arabia not planning to join that agreement. Saudi Arabia moving closer to Iran diplomatically with the support of China. The UAE far more reticent about that relationship and what it means. You know, will the UAE go back to its previous posture and see its future still more closely aligned to the United States, whereas Saudi Arabia wants this multipolar world where it can play one side of the other, China, India, the US. I think that the whole debate around that key relationship internally in OPEC is going to come back next year and isn't fully resolved.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. I think at all of these points, and as I say, that the multitude of announcements that were made over the weekend, I think we'll probably be revisiting them all as soon as obviously July with this unilateral cut by Saudi. Will it continue? Which obviously is the next big question for the markets and for the journalists to be chasing. But where will that second half of the year demand go in the context of Asia and China? And then I think that those production quotas, they're still so far away from the reality of both those that can produce more and those that can't produce the existing quotas, that you would think that still has to come closer together in order for that production quota structure to be credible and have a purpose in the market. As long as that gap both on the upside for those that can produce more on the downside for those that can't, I think that it weakens it as a tool to tackle market management. But nonetheless, a lot to talk about coming out of the weekend. But the one thing that doesn't seem to be knocking the ball out of the park is Brent crude oil, which is sort of slumbering along a +1% on the news this morning. Will that change when Europe and the US markets wake up and get their teeth into this narrative? Perhaps it will. Which direction, however, we'll have to see. Listen, thank you so much, Andy Critchlow. Awesome. Congrats again on your big bike win, and good luck in Scotland later in the summer. Kate Durian, thank you so much. And as always, Omar Najia anchoring the Monday mornings. We really appreciate it. Have a great week, everybody. All the best.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.